Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Corin Lightbourne, and I am the Business Development Coordinator for Infrastructure, Technology, Asset Management, and High Net Worth Services at the Bermuda Business Development Agency, which is also known as the BDA. The BDA is an independent public and private partnership, and our focus is on promoting the jurisdiction as well as encouraging economic development and inward direct investment. We've teamed up with Step Bermuda and Bolt for a series of webinars, which we're hoping to continue throughout this year and in the coming years. Today, we present some of the industry's subject matter experts who will discuss key AML and ATF considerations for trust businesses. Thank you again for joining us today. I will now pass it on to Ashley Fife, the Step Bermuda chairman, who will introduce our presenters for today. Ashley?
Thanks, Corin. Sorry, it took me a little while to turn on. I get a little shy when it comes to these presentations. Again, it's a pleasure to be working with Bermuda Business Development Association and now the Bermuda Association of Licensed Trustees to deliver these talks to you. Today, we have the pleasure of Michael Wynn, Senior Vice President of Regulatory and Compliance Services at Walkers, and Melanie Fullerton, Senior Associate of the Regulatory Risk and Advisory Group at Walkers, delivering this talk today on compliance issues facing our sectors. Just a little bit of background about the presenters. Michael has a Big Four risk advisory experience and is responsible for the delivery of regulatory and operational compliance engagements ranging from compliance, construction assessment and remediation to training and internal control testing. Michael is also a very keen skydiver, and I think with his background in the military is the closest that we've had to Jason Bourne joining us to present. So it's certainly a pleasure to have him. It's also a pleasure to have Melanie present. She has extensive experience working in private and also in the public sector, having worked for a period with the Bermuda Monetary Association, where she was an integral member of the CFATF Mutual Evaluation Assessment and was responsible for completing the technical assessment. I think looking through the slides for today and talking to the presenters beforehand, this is going to be a very pragmatic and informative session. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand over to the speakers. Who will join us shortly.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to get onto the camera. Is there any chance that you can turn that on for me? Here we are. Okay. Okay, are we good? Good morning and welcome to this presentation on the AML ATF considerations for trust business. As an intro, my name is Michael Wynn. I'm an SVP at Walkers and I'm the head of the regulatory compliance team. I've worked at the firm now for almost 12 months, worked at one of the Big Four prior, and I deal with everything to do with AML, ATF, and sanctions compliance. I'm also joined by Mel, so I will hand it over to Mel, and she can do her introduction. Mel?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. As Ashley did a very kind introduction, I'm Melanie Fullerton, and I am a senior associate at Walkers. I sit in a very unique practice group in Walkers, which is the Regulatory and Risk Advisory Group. It's a group of dedicated lawyers, and there are lawyers in each of Walkers' jurisdictions across the globe that specialize in financial regulatory matters. So Michael and I work very closely in the AML ATF space, and we hope you enjoy our presentation today.
Awesome, thank you, Mel. Okay, so the way that this will work is Mel will start and she's going to go into the AML ATF typologies for 2020 and then go into what that means for trusts. We'll then switch to the compliance side. I'll talk about the issues that we've seen over the last 6 months, the impact to the business and the impact to clients. And what I'll do after that is I'll give you some tips and tricks that you can use. So if you see any of these from your work, then it'll be easier for you to pinpoint them and fix them. Then we'll end with the cheesy sales pitch as per, and we'll see if you have anything else to add, and we'll take some questions. Okay, Mel, I will now hand over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Mike. So we thought it would be interesting to start today's presentation by discussing some of the money laundering and terrorist financing typologies that have been reported globally throughout 2020. These typologies aren't necessarily connected to trust business specifically, but many can be applied or considered in relation to the context of trust business. So like everything in 2020, COVID-19 exacerbated money laundering and terrorist financing risks due to the fact that COVID-19 changed how people do business and where people do business. It obviously had devastating financial effects for many people and also several businesses, all of which presented a beautiful landscape of vulnerability that unfortunately bad actors look to exploit and take advantage of. Throughout the initial stages of the pandemic, FATF and FinCEN, for example, and other global groups and regulators were very quick to sort of assess how COVID-19 was going to affect money laundering and terrorist financing, and have produced several reports to that effect, which are very useful. As I've said, COVID-19 disrupted business activity and it decentralized the workplace. Entities stopped allowing customers into their storefronts, workplaces were closed for a long period of time and may still be closed. And what felt like overnight, we went from sitting at our desks at offices with all of our colleagues to being homebound, trying to get into our remote access computers and servers. We stopped receiving sort of hard copy documents and signatures, and we're relying on PDFs and DocuSign, and I think Adobe now has a safe signature block as well. So there was a massive shift in a very short amount of time. You had many more people receiving increases in cash as governments handed out financial support to support employees who were no longer employed, and to provide grants to businesses to sort of help them survive the period of COVID-19. And there was an increased reliance, therefore, on cash, which, as you will know, will provide new opportunities for people that have bad intentions to generate and launder illicit proceeds. So all of these changes in behavior, how humans did business, how businesses operated, the expanded landscape that employees, workers, and businesses took up, they all provide sort of contextual factors that increase money laundering and terrorist financing vulnerabilities that bad actors saw as great opportunity. So for 2020, there was, come as no surprise, there was an increase in fraud. And this includes everything from the impersonation of individuals to counterfeiting of essential goods such as medicines. There's been counterfeit vaccines. There was counterfeit masks apparently going around. And then you had people establishing fake businesses for fake purposes. And this largely affected the charitable organizations, where people were setting up charities in the name of COVID-19 and providing COVID-19 relief, when in fact they were actually just money laundering schemes. And also, as people were looking to, re-employ themselves or find jobs in the short term or to earn some cash, there was a substantial increase of online fraudulent investment schemes, which I'm sure we've all heard of. All of these factors increase the money laundering and terrorist risks, and relying on the vulnerabilities have developed as a result of COVID. Also, there was an increase in cybercrime. I think it will come as no surprise, and I'm sure all of you have experienced an increase in sort of phishing emails coming into your inbox. It's pretty amazing the sophistication of these emails that look very similar to emails that you would receive on a daily basis, whether they be from banks or your service providers or even potentially customers that are actually fraudulent scams. If you click on any of the links in these phishing emails, your whole server can be exposed. Bad actors can obtain your username and password. They can get into the back end of your computer and, change texts in emails, change dollar amounts in emails, and change the banking details to have money wired to themselves rather than to where it's supposed to go. You may have heard that the World Health Organization was subject to a phishing scam where somebody impersonated the World Health Organization. In a time of COVID, we would, wouldn't be unusual to receive such emails from the WHO. And in fact, it was just, it was a money laundering scheme to get people to deposit cash into a bank account that was going to be used for illicit purposes. I'm sure we all have many more examples of that as well. So business emails and shutdowns increased, and we're all forced to sort of to work from home. There was challenges on business continuity and where businesses had potential to have employees work from home. Perhaps they hadn't considered the volume and the number of people across several jurisdictions that were going to have to rely on remote servers and rely on technology. And that all just presents, a vulnerability that people can take advantage of. Bad actors were then capable of exploiting the sort of poor connections. And then they, like I said, they would obtain sensitive information and fraudulently use that against you to receive payments, etc. It was interesting reading a Google report on COVID-19 and seeing that during the COVID-19 period, the increase in ransomware attacks was increased by 148%. And of that, 38% of those were specifically targeted at the financial services industry. Google reported that 18 million daily malware phishing emails were caught by them, an additional 240 million spam messages that related specifically to COVID-19. So there was quite a lot going on in the space. So just going on to the next slide. So how do these typologies that we've seen globally, that are increasing the risks and vulnerabilities of money laundering, terror financing, how do they relate back to trust businesses and specifically relate back to Bermuda? Well, if we consider customer due diligence in the first instance, it's never really been more important to know your customer and actually know your customer and to verify their identity. As I said, one of the typologies was impersonation of identity. So the definition, and for trust businesses, this is often a bit more complicated. For a regular sort of financial institution, you might have an individual or individuals that come, present themselves, and your customer is that individual who wants to obtain your services or to establish a business relationship. Whereas for trust businesses, your customer can be a number of people. It can be it can be individuals, it can be settlers, there can be numerous beneficiaries, there's trustees, you might have third-party service providers. And so trying to keep a handle on the verification and identity of all of those customers can be quite difficult. And unfortunately, during COVID-19 and ongoing to now, it's really important to really have a handle on who it is you're dealing with and be comfortable with who is emailing you or providing you with instructions is in fact the individual you think it is. Transaction monitoring. So this has become, increasingly difficult also. As I said, COVID has disrupted businesses. It's disrupted how we do business. It's disrupted where we do business. So naturally, it might disrupt how, an entity functions, where they're sending wire payments, the volume of those payments. And so trust businesses should be then confirming with the customer that any change in their behavior and any change in the transactions that they're conducting is in fact to be expected and in good faith rather than someone trying to take advantage of a system. Then we look at internal controls. And obviously there are a multitude of internal controls that we could talk about, but I think it's really important to focus on sort of the first line of defense, and that would be your compliance officer and your money laundering reporting officer. In COVID-19, we're all working from home, where those roles, are held by two different individuals, or whether they're held by one individual. It's becoming increasingly important to let your employees know that they still exist. The AML ATF is still very much important, and that should they have any suspicion, that they need to report that to the appropriate person. For trust businesses and any business really, this might be a really good time to increase the amount of money laundering and terrorist financing training that happens. This can be held in a variety of ways, whether it's, a short pop quiz every now and then, or a more formal training session to protect and educate people about cybercrime, as that was the typology of 2020. You can maybe work with your IT service provider to send sort of fake phishing emails and see how many employees can identify that they are in fact phishing emails, or how many employees, click on them and away they go. That's a really good way to gauge people's awareness. But all of these things need to be considered in a COVID-19 environment where the workplace is completely decentralized. For most, that takes us into suspicious activity reporting. And it was actually really interesting to read that even though we are at this increased risk due to COVID-19 and the problems that it presents, there wasn't a sort of proportionate amount of suspicious activity reports being filed. And the thinking behind this was that, maybe companies are just so focused on business continuity that suspicious activity reporting isn't at the forefront of people's minds. Maybe it's because it's really hard to identify what is suspicious now because of that transaction monitoring changing. People not knowing what their clients are doing, or having the resources or maybe the technology at home to monitor transactions and understand the behavior of the customer. It could also be that your office relies on a quite manual system to conduct suspicious activity reporting, and now that you're virtual, they don't have access to that manual system, and so it's time to sort of revisit how those internal SARs are reported. Maybe you have to establish an email inbox that just the money laundering reporting officer can access, where employees can file any internal reports. So it's really just considering all of these aspects, taking those typologies and seeing how they affect your business. Lastly, we just go on to ongoing monitoring, which I won't go on too much about because I think we've covered it, but I think COVID has presented just, like I said, a change in customer behavior. A year ago, I don't think any of us thought we'd still be working remotely. We thought this was going to be something that would last a couple of months, and away it went. But you really have to understand the business purpose of your client. Why did they set up this trust fund? Who should be receiving money? Is that who is receiving money? Is it in the amounts that they should be receiving? And really scrutinizing the transactions and being proportionate and taking a risk-based approach to how you sort of question those transactions. So I will now hand over to my colleague, Michael, who will provide you with some practical compliance considerations for trust businesses in light of COVID, and also on a go-forward basis.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mel. Okay. Issue-wise, these are what we've seen over the last 6 months. And the best place to start is where most of them seem to start, with the BRA, business risk. One of the key things to point out is when it comes to the BRA, this is your chance to look at the AML risk that you face and then plan to put some kind of controls in place in order to bring that risk down, in order to transfer it to a third party. But the key thing to point out is what you put down in the BRA and the time that you put into that, it really tends to cascade down to everything else that you do in terms of when it comes to the AML framework. So it will go down to the risk assessment, probably for the customers first. It'll hit that first. And what it will do is it will choose to define how you choose to risk rate them. Then obviously that goes down further to the EDD and probably to the CDD as well. And when it comes to the long term, it will also choose to define how many times that you have to go back and check everything when it comes to the CDD of the clients. Issues that we see when it comes to the BRA, the first one is that it's too vague. This is the risk that we face, and then when it comes to the control, it's one line. It's rules-based. This is the risk that we face, and we must do this every single time. There's no room for flex. There's no room to be risk-based. It's rules. And issue number 3 would be, it just doesn't make sense. So impact-wise, what does this mean? Well, let's take this first one. Let's look at the risk of PEPs and PEPs in any part of a trust. Commit any part. The risk that you face is that you may have a PEP. Let's say the PEP is a settler. So you say, okay, this is the risk that we face. And then the control that you want to put in place is say, okay, we will now deem all PEPs to be treated as high risk. So this is at the first stage now for the BRA, for the business risk assessment. And then this will then cascade down to the customer risk. So let's say that you're dealing with a bank from England, and on the board they have a PEP. This should really be low risk, but because of what you put down in the BRA, it's going to cascade down to the CRA, and this is now deemed as high risk. Impact first is obviously going to be on you. It's going to be to the compliance team. It's going to take them more time to get everything that they need when it comes to the documentation, and it will actually also then turn it into cost. Extra time spent means more cost. Again, because it's high risk, it'll mean that you need to come back to this clients at least once every 12 months, and you'll need to check everything when it comes to the CDD and the sanction screening too. I mean, obviously that should be done at the end of each night, but that could change as well. Competitiveness. It's one of the things that we don't tend to think about when we think of rules and regulations. Compliance can be used to give you the edge, and this is one of the themes that I'll also talk more on. But what this really means when it comes to the customer is it's super frustrating. And we've had this lots and lots. Maybe when you go into a bank, maybe when you go to Belco, you can see that, or you think that you will be deemed as low risk, but yet you are deemed as high risk, and then you have to give reams and reams of information and documentation. It's time consuming. It takes a lot of time as well. If you think of everything that you need to get, and then when it comes to the certification part as well, taking that, to a law firm, it's extra time spent. Ultimately, what it means when it comes to the customer is it's actually going to make them easier to just go to a different trust company, because it takes up too much of their time and it's just easier to go elsewhere. So this is from the top down. So now issue 2 and 3 will be part of the same thing, the enhanced due diligence, EDD. Issue 1 is we still see lots now that when it comes to clients that come to you that are by non-face-to-face means, they are automatically deemed as high risk. Again, this is rules-based, it's not risk-based, which means if they're high risk, then they're subject to enhanced due diligence and everything that you need them to provide you with. So again, why is this? We always go back to the BRA. to the business risk. What is the risk that you are faced with? So the risk here would be when it comes to the customers, someone has come to the trust company and they're keen to set up a trust, but they're coming in via non-face-to-face means. Okay, so again, if we're vague and it's rules-based, we'll say, okay, first thing, everybody that is non-face-to-face will be dealt with as high risk. And when it comes to the documentation, it needs to be certified. So, impact. Let's say that we have someone that's keen to come into your firm and to set up a family trust. They're known to pretty much everybody on the board, but based on the fact that they came into the company via non-face-to-face means, that means that they're high risk. Okay. So then what this means, again, is when it comes to the business, it's going to take you more time. It's going to cost you even more. And again, when it comes to the client, it's super frustrating. It's going to take more of their time and it's going to make it easier for them to go elsewhere. So coming even further down, certification culture. This is a real thorn in my side, because when it comes to compliance, it should be risk-based. It should be practical. So, let me get to it. Issues that we see. Certification, if you go back to the regulation, it falls under the EDD part, which is only meant for those that are deemed as high risk. That's the first thing. But when you think of what is this trying to do, its aim is to change the risk of anybody that comes into the company via non-face-to-face means. It's basically a anti-fraud risk. But if you go back to the rules and regulations, it's actually one of the three things that we can put in place. But we always seem to choose this. So what does this mean impact-wise? So again, for the third time, because everything stems from the BRA in terms of what we do from one day to the next, we go back to the BRA and we say, okay, this is the risk that we're faced with. So everybody that is non-face-to-face, when it comes to the CDD, we want it all to be stamped, good to go for the certification. But somehow it kind of morphs. And then when you delve into the policies and procedures, it now says that everybody must give you some form of CDD that has gone through the same process. It's certified. Okay. So if everybody now has to do this again, this may mean that, let's say that you've got trustee A and trustee B. You go to trustee A and you're keen to set up a trust. Purpose trust could be any type of trust. Trustee A want you to come in and meet them want you to come in and meet them face to face. Then for the second time that you come in, you need to bring passport, proof of address, source of funds, source of wealth, and it needs to be certified, which then means for you that you need to then go to a CA or maybe go to a law firm. And when it comes to the source of wealth part, they actually want you to bring in 6 months worth of pay slips. Okay. So then you go to trustee B. Trustee B said, no. Obviously things have changed now as well because of these last 12 months, COVID risk as well. So they said, no. One of the things that we can do is we can call you, see you over Zoom. And then when it comes to the CDD docs that we want from you, you can just go onto the passport, you can just go onto the website and upload those. And when it comes to the source of wealth, it's the same thing. You go onto the website, fill out a form, sign. This is where I work. This is what I earn, signed, done. Now, if you had a choice in trustee A and trustee B, which one would you choose to go for? Now, I do know that when it comes to trust and when it comes to the clients, they can be more on the conservative end, but that will change. Times do change, and even now, I think from these last 12 months, things have changed really, really fast. So, from everything that we've seen, when it comes to the BRA and the enhanced due diligence, what are the themes that we see? Impact, sorry, prior to that, yeah, it's the same thing. It's more time and cost for you, and then when it comes to the customer, it's easier for them to go elsewhere. The key themes that we see, and why we see the same things over and over, is down to 4 things. Rules-based. When it comes to compliance, it needs to be risk-based. The rules and regs are obviously a guide, and you need to find a way. Obviously, when it comes to the policies and procedures to comply, but why make this harder? Why make this slower? It doesn't make sense. Complacency. Bermuda's a chilled out place. It's a great place, but this is one of the traps that we always seem to fall into. We have had, maybe when it comes to the BRA, we might have had that up and running, let's say, since 2016, since 2010. So if it worked fine then surely it works fine now. Challenge. This is actually linked also to the 4th one. If we understand this more, as in what we're being asked to do from the rules and regulations, then it's easier then for us to push back. It's easier for us to say, okay, why do we need to do this? And is there any way that we can make this easier, more streamlined? So what are the tips that we have that can help to fix some of these issues that we've seen? Again, everything starts with the BRA. Go back to that and look at what you have put down, and then it will be easy to draw that map. Okay, we do this from one day to the next, and it's really slow and it's quite old school. Why? And draw that line. It always goes back, or it always should go back to the BRA, to the risk assessment for the business. Culture. When it comes to culture, it's one of those words that we see a lot, but it's really hard to measure and it's really hard to change. So one of the things that we need to do is we actually need to talk to staff, and we need to say, if you think that there's any way that we can make change, if you think there's any way that we can streamline it, come out and tell us. Training, as I said, when it comes to the last slide, this will make it easier to challenge. This will make it easier to push back. This will make it easier to change. If you have that skill set, then it's easier to make change because it makes you confident. Innovation. When it comes to technology, it doesn't have to be technology. Obviously, it's easy to jump to that, like it could really just be any way to streamline. But if you think that there's a chance that, okay, we can save time here and we can save cost, then it could be worth a try. But the key that I think to change is to put yourself in the shoes of those in the shoes of those that you serve every day. Think about how hard it is for them. Think of how hard it is for you when you speak to the banks, or when when you'll have to deal with the same rules-based kind of compliance. And if you actually can put yourself in their shoes, it's easier for you to feel that pain, and then it's easier for you then to make change. Any questions?
Many thanks. That's a very helpful session. I certainly think that we in Bermuda, or service providers in Bermuda, should be looking towards that more pragmatic and actually applying a risk-based approach rather than a rules-based approach. And that's a way of distinguishing the jurisdiction from others.
Sure.
I also think that the acronym BRA is just fantastic. It gives rise to the question, what came first, the acronym or the term? I think that if I was coming up with a term, I would come up with something similar.
Yeah. But do you know what I think in terms of BRA? I always think BRA and similar to brain, and that is the brain that everything tends to stem from when it comes to the compliance processes.
That's a much more mature approach to the one that I gave to.
Yeah, I don't want to offend anyone.
So I do have a few questions, and one thing that interests me is the distinguishing between outsourcing and reliance on third parties. And I was just wondering if you could outline those differences.
Okay, I'm going to pass that over to Mel, because she is best placed to probably deal with that.
Yeah, so this comes up a lot, particularly when I was at the BMA. A lot of regulated financial institutions would ask the question, what is the difference between reliance and outsourcing? And it would be picked up a lot on on-site reports, where the BMA had conducted an on-site. And it is a bit tricky, but I think basically, you can rely on a third party to conduct your customer due diligence, and you can outsource a function of the business. So you can, and the parameters for reliance, I think it's in accordance with Regulation 14 of the Proceeds of Crime regulations. You can only rely on a third party to conduct customer due diligence. You can't, for example, rely on a third party to completely escaping me, but for example, to do your risk assessments or to do your draft, you can't rely on another party's policies and procedures to therefore run your business. So under Regulation 14, it's very specific about what activities you can rely on a third party to provide and who those third parties must be for that reliance relationship to be lawful and in compliance with the regulations. For anybody who wants further guidance on that, the guidance notes that have been issued by the BMA, not necessarily the sector-specific guidance notes for trust business, but the general ones, there's quite a lot of information in those on what is reliance, what will be accepted by the BMA in relation to reliance relationships. And it's very narrow. So you can rely on a third party to apply your customer due diligence measures, so they can identify and verify your customers. They can identify and verify your beneficial owners of your customers, and they can work to understand the intended business of your customers. And you would be solely relying on them to conduct those activities to the level required by Bermuda law. So if you have an entity conducting it that's not situated in the jurisdiction, it is on the regulated financial institution to ensure that that business is operating to the standards of the BMA, to the Proceeds of Crime Act, the regulations, and in accordance with the guidance notes. But you cannot, for example, rely on somebody to do your ongoing monitoring or to report your suspicious activity. There are certain entities that can provide this reliance relationship, and those are really limited to AML, ATF regulated financial institutions within the jurisdiction. So if you're a trust company, you may be able to rely on a bank that's introducing a customer to you, for example, or independent professionals. So I think that is restricted to sort of accountants, medical doctors, I think, and lawyers. But the important thing, whereas the difference is with outsourcing, you would sort of be outsourcing a function of your compliance framework. So the example that we find mostly is that you would outsourcing your compliance officer and your money laundering risk officer role to someone to conduct for you. That has to be done on a risk-based approach. There is no way, for example, that a bank could outsource their compliance officer or their money laundering reporting officer, but perhaps a smaller, we see some of the digital asset businesses as they're establishing themselves, outsourcing that role. And as they continue to grow and as their business scales up, you would be constantly risk assessing that relationship to see if it's still appropriate for that relationship to exist. And what's important to remember between a Reliance and an outsourcing relationship is there has to be a service agreement in place, and that service agreement should be explicit on exactly what that third party is expected to do. What is the role of the entity? What is the role of the third party? You have to ensure that documents are easily accessible under each relationship, particularly under a Reliance relationship. The regulated financial institution should almost have instant access to any of the documents that have been used to identify and verify their customer. And you cannot outsource the risk or the responsibility. So whilst you might engage third parties to assist you with these functions, it is the sole responsibility of the regulated financial institution to ensure that everything is being conducted properly. So as Mike has said in his presentation, it really comes down to, you would probably want to conduct a risk assessment on those relationships, those specific relationships. Is it appropriate for our business as a whole to outsource, our CDD aspect, or are we going to keep that in-house because, it just makes more sense from a risk profile, be easier for our customer, and sort of assess that on a case-by-case service provider basis.
Good answer, Mel. Fantastic.
Michael, you mentioned before some of the cost benefits of perhaps educating staff as opposed to just relying on a blanket approach. I was just wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to compliance, that we've fallen almost into this, I don't know if it's like trap or not, but it's like I do my work and then that gets checked, and then his or her work gets checked, then that gets checked, and it seems to me that it takes an awful lot of time, but also when it comes to the culture, it doesn't really show that you're putting like a lot of trust as well. Because if I know that every piece of work that I do will get checked, then it's easy then for me to just be, complacent. So I think that if we can almost make change so we don't keep checking the same things, but rather put that time into training staff, better. Compliance is obviously not a new thing, but it is fast paced, and it's, so I think that anything that we can do when it comes to the staff to train them is key, and it pays off.
So they actually apply a risk-based approach rather than the rules-based approach unnecessarily. That's
it, yeah, because if you think about it, when it comes to rules-based, it's very, it's really, really hard. It's really, really hard then to make any kind of judgment call, because it's set in stone. So then it's almost easier then to just see your job and your role as, okay, well, I do this for every single one, or I do this for everybody. Whereas if you're actually trained well and pushed to think more, then it'll be easier then to obviously change that in from rules and vague to to more free thought and risk-based.
I still see some service providers insist on wedding signatures, which seems to doesn't seem to be a very risk-based approach. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, for the certification point, obviously, I know that I can push that one, and I know that there's change there. When it comes to the wet ink stuff, Mel, have you got any thoughts on that? Is that more like a legal risk, or?
Yeah, I think you would have to assess it as a legal risk, but we are very much, the market and industry are now accepting sort of the DocuSign or electronic signatures that can be verified by the person whose signature it is. And I think particularly in COVID, I think that was adopted almost overnight. There are some documents that cannot be signed by electronic signature, which I think relate to sort of property transactions. They still have to have wedding signatures, which makes sense, I guess. But yeah, I think we're definitely seeing a shift in the market. And I don't know if that was really just a thrust from COVID or if that was something that existed, but people were sort of nervous about. I think people do quite enjoy when a transaction is ready to complete. I do think there is some sort of joy of going into the lawyer's office and sort of signing your wedding signature, which now, you're just clicking a button on DocuSign or on Adobe. But I think it's definitely an accepted practice. And I think that links in well to a question that I see that's popped up, where people are using Zoom to sort of regulate the approval of documents, throughout the incorporation process. This is definitely something that we've seen. And I think a good tool to use is we would expect you to sort of receive a paper copy or a scan of that passport prior to the Zoom call with the individual, and then ask them, get them to not only put that passport document in the camera so you can cross-check the details, but ask them questions about themselves. Just sort of engage in conversation and see if you can cross-check any of the details that are provided on that passport or proof of address or whichever document that it is you're being asked to certify.
I just see perhaps a related question that seems to have cropped up while you were speaking, Mel. Is there a specific guidance by the BDA regulator on wedding certification versus virtual when it comes to CDD of an individual?
Michael might be best placed to provide the particulars on this. I haven't seen anything come up from the BMA that relates specifically to that, but FATF definitely has. FATF issued a paper on digital ID during COVID, which was really interesting. And again, it was probably on their agenda for a while, but it's kind of been pushed forward to the agenda due to COVID and the lack of face-to-face interaction. So I don't know if Michael, if you had anything to add.
In terms of technology, I think there's obviously key things that you can put in place, but when it comes to wet ink, that's not one of the things that I've seen when it comes to the guidance. Yeah, I'd have to take a look at that further.
I certainly haven't seen anything specific to wet ink.
No, certification, yes, but wet ink. Good question though, and something to look into.
And I think this question perhaps flows on for us to perhaps revert to separately. I think it's the same questionnaire. How do you prove to the regulator during an on-site, which generally why institutions require wet ink certification? I guess perhaps there's some pressure felt by service providers that the regulator anticipates wet ink certification to prove beyond doubt that it's been certified, but I think that goes perhaps
The
goes back to
certification is 100%. I think it's just, again, I think that it just tends to go back to culture, but it always, but like it also would also go back to the fact that maybe this is what we were told to do, maybe in 2008, or this is how things were done then. And it's just that we have not really tried to go back to that and make change or challenge it. So really, it's obviously down to, I think, in terms of skill set, like it's down to have that as well, and knowing where to look, and like and how to make change. But I also think as well that when it comes to the BMA, it'd be good as well if you could speak to them.
But I think too, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, ma'am, go on.
If you're going to change the way you certify documents or the way you accept customer due diligence documents, whether that's through the use of tech or relying on other documents, or relying on a third party to do that, that would require you to go back and revise your policies and procedures. That would require you to go back and reassess your business risk assessment and see how that is affecting the inherent risk of your business. And I think that is where the BMA would be interested in seeing. If you're going to take a step forward and move away from, the old good lawyer stamp with the signature and the date for every passport and proof of address that you receive, then the BMA are going to expect to see that you risk assess that use, and that it filters through into your policies and procedures. Your staff are trained on it. They know how to identify when whatever technology or use case that you're using is not being followed appropriately. I asked the question, how do I know somebody hasn't gotten a DocuSign signature and just applied it to this document? Like, what is the verification for that? So it's important to ask the questions. It's important to educate your staff. It's important to have these written into your policies and procedures, and then speak to them when the BMA come to do an on-site. You can say, due to COVID, or we're looking to streamline our customer due diligence without reducing its effectiveness, and have these conversations with them, and have the documents to prove that you've really considered all of the aspects that go along with it.
Absolutely.
I think by way of an observation that based on a question that's come up, I think that this talk certainly has been encouraging training of employees throughout the firm to have knowledge of the distinction between a risk and rules-based approach, so that they can help to inform that process, rather than simply without question apply a rules-based approach, which may frustrate clients. I guess it can be a delicate balancing act for an employer, and perhaps it's just, I think educating employees is in this field can only be good for the reasons you've mentioned. There's also I guess it's balanced against the risk for the employer if a more junior employee doesn't correctly apply a risk-based approach. But I think that's part of the risk that needs to be managed in terms of educating employees. Has got to be, I can't see how it can be a negative thing in this space, but there still needs to be appropriate checks based upon them, and also and the efficiency of that taken into account.
Yeah, and then I also think as well, like in terms of training, it's probably best to call us as well, like, and we can talk you through when it comes to the courses, like if you're keen to take one of those, or if there's anything that is pretty key that you're keen to be trained on, we can talk you through it, and point you off to the right kind of direction.
And I think too, it's remembering too that just reading the question, that it is the employees are your first line of defense. So, on a risk-based approach, you have an employee, perhaps they they don't realize that the customer standing in front of them is a politically exposed person, so they don't ask for their source of funds or their source of wealth at the initial interaction. That shouldn't be the only time that money laundering and terrorist financing risk is being assessed. So that might be your first line of defense where, oh gosh, that employee made a mistake. We need more information or further information on this individual. That should be caught by your second line of defense, which might be your onboarding team, for example. Excuse me. So I appreciate the concern, and it is all about assessing risk. But part of that risk assessment should be ensuring that those 3 lines of defense, at a very minimum, are in place to capture mistakes, because we're all human and we're all going to make them. But it's just about ensuring that your staff know, they know about AML ATF. They understand the importance of collecting it, not only from trying to stop money laundering, but also for the business and the wealth of the business. And then to have all of the risks and mitigations, all of the mitigations for risks in place, beyond the front counter of your business.
Yeah, and I think just to end on that as well, when it comes to the first line, it is really key as well that they can get into the mindset where everything that they do in terms of work, only maybe half of that is checked, so then it kind of pushes them to obviously think, what, I have to get this right that first time. It's easy for the first line to think, oh well, I can do like half a job and send it to the second line, and then things take time. Whereas if we can get to the first line and train them up, to the highest standard, it makes it easier then. Yeah. So it's a balancing act, isn't it?
And I think, as you said, when we were perhaps in your slides, and also as we were talking before this, professional engagement is key. The more employees that we have with developing their knowledge in this area and engaging with it, the more efficient we can make it for our businesses and our clients, which increases profitability and increases client contentment.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's good for the jurisdiction as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. We want to be a jurisdiction with a culture of excellence.
Yeah, and streamlined and efficient. Awesome.
Well, I have to say that I found that a very engaging, informative presentation, and I thank you so much for making time to deliver this. I'm sure that there may be other questions that viewers that may come to mind. I think the questions are still coming in, but perhaps, of course, please, viewers, reach out to Melanie and Michael with your questions. They'd only be more than happy to help you. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.